Jackie yet. I'm Elizabeth Cohen, president of Temple Israel, and I really want to thank you all for coming out here during a weeknight, a work night, but for an important sombering event to commemorate Yom HaShoa, our Holocaust Remembrance Day. And what this is about is for us as a community to learn from each other. And our goal for us was to do more outreach into the community and to invite the schools to that teach Holocaust Jewish history in their English and social studies classes from middle school up to the high school to come here and learn from us. And then we can also work together. And thank you for Dr. Levinson for being here and being part of that catalyst for us, because she is also wanting to go to be with you in the classroom. So it's for you then to have this opportunity to talk with her and take what you see here and to take that to your students and to take that out into the community. So I thank every one of you for coming. It just takes one person to make change in this rise of anti-Semitism in the world right now. It is, you may have seen, there's a Blue Square campaign that shows, it'll show up on a TV screen, and that shows this is the percentage of Jews in the world, but it has the highest rate of anti-Semitism and crime, hate crimes in the world at the moment. So it is to bring more awareness into our community, though our community has been wonderful to us, and I really thank you for being such a warm, loving community to us. But education is always ongoing. We never stop learning from each other. So again, I thank you, and I will hand this over now to our cantor, Debbie Miller, and to Rabbi Shoshana Pfefferman. Thank you.
Welcome, everyone. We're honored tonight to have with us our guest speaker, Professor Rosalie Levinson, and her husband. We also welcome the Valparaiso previous mayor, John Costas, who would love to be the next one too. There's a We welcome pastors of the local churches, members of the city council, educators of the local school, members of the Jewish and non-Jewish community, and our own temple members, and especially those whose loved ones either perished in or survived the Holocaust. Before I forget, please turn your phones down or off if you don't mind. We begin with silence, the silence of death, the silence after destruction. There are times when songs falter, when darkness fills life, when martyrdom becomes a constellation of faith against the unrelieved lack of space about us. There are no words to reach beyond the edge of night, no messenger to tell the full tale. There's only silence, the silence of Job, the silence of 6 million, the silence of memory. Let us remember them as we link our silences. We continue with the song that was written by Hannah Senesh, and I would like to say a few words about her. Hannah Senesh was born in Budapest in 1921, and she was a poet and also one of the 37 special operation executives recruits who parachuted by the British into German occupied Yugoslavia in order, between 1943 and 1945, in order to organize resistance to the Nazis and carry out an assignment led by the Jewish Agency of Palestine at the time, because she already immigrated to Israel. So while helping out rescuing Jews during the Holocaust, she was captured by the Nazis and was killed. So 2 of her songs will sing tonight. Eli, Eli, my God, my God.
שלא ייגמר לעולם. החודי הים, רשרוש של המים, ברק השמיים, תפילת האדם, החול והים, רשרוש של המים, ברק השמיים, תפילת האדם. Lord my God, I pray that these things never end. The sand and the sea, the rush of the waters, the crash of the heavens, the prayer of the heart, the sand and the sea, the rush of the waters, the crash of the heavens, the prayer of the heart.
We kindle these candles in sacred memory of all the victims of the Holocaust who perished between the years 1939 and 1945. In memory of the 6 million murdered Jewish people, among them 1.5 million innocent children who had not reached the age of bar or bat mitzvah, and in memory of the many other millions of victims of the Nazi regime. May their memory live on for eternity, and may their sacrifice, courage, and martyrdom be held precious and sacred and never be forgotten by the world. We will start with lighting the candles, and candle number 1, we would ask the former mayor, John Costas, to come forward, please. Do you want to help? Yes. Just light. And just when I'm done reading, you light the candle. We'll say, "We shall not forget," and you light it, okay? We light this candle in memory of the helpless infant, children, and teenagers whose dreams, hope, and lives were snuffed out before they even had a chance to experience life. Together, we shall not forget. For the second candles, Professor Rosalie Levinson. We light this candle in memory of all the scholars, teachers, and rabbis who were first to be seized. We shall not forget. Dr. Rachel Coulter. We light this candle for the untold millions for whom there is no one to mourn, whose entire families were annihilated, and who lie in unmarked graves. We shall not forget. Debbie, you're the fourth. We light this candle for those who stood upright while others were bending to unmoral will, for the righteous people who risked and even gave their lives to help their fellow human beings, and for the heroes of the resistance who fought the Nazis, so few against so many. We shall not forget. The next candle, Mike Kesner. We light this candle for those brave soldiers who liberated the camps, who carried the dead and near dead in their arms to a kinder and more human future, and for those who served with the Allied forces to put an end to tyranny and oppression. We shall not forget. Linda Brown, sixth candle. We light this candle for the millions of non-Jewish people who also perished in a planned system of human destruction, the scale of which had never before been imagined. We shall not forget. Thank you. Please take a moment of silent meditation. Another song that was written by Hannah Senesh is called, in Hebrew, Ashrei HaGafur, in English, Blessed is the Match. Blessed is the match consumed in kindling flame. Blessed is the flame that burns in the secret fastness of the heart. Blessed is the heart with the strength to stop its beating for honor's sake. Blessed is the match consumed in kindling flame.
אשרי הגפרור שנשרף והצית להבות. אשרי הלהבה שבערה לסתרי לבבות. אשרי הלבבות שידעו לחדול בחמור. אשרי הגפרור שנשרף והצית להבות.
So, we are thankful that Professor Levinson will be speaking tonight. And I would like to take the opportunity to once again thank you all for being here and helping us to remember those who perished in the Holocaust. Now we need to turn our attention to the present and the future. It is not enough just to remember, but we must also learn a lesson from this crime against humanity. We must take action to prevent tragedies like the Holocaust to ever happen. We hope that the world learned from history. As we remember the incredible loss of so many of our people and keep their memory alive, we need to show compassion and not stand idly by when other people experience their own Holocaust. I would like to conclude with writing that was found on a cellar wall in Cologne, Germany, written by someone who was hiding from the Nazis. And he says, "Believe in the sun when it's not shining. I believe in love when I feel it not. I believe in God even when God is silent." And that is very powerful, very hopeful message. And we'll conclude with the song Ani Ma'amin, I believe. It says, "I believe with perfect faith in the Messiah's coming, and even if he is delayed, I will await him."
אני מאמין, אני מאמין, אני מאמין, באמונה שלמה, בביאת המשיח, ועם כל זאת אחכה לו בכל יום שיבוא.
Thank you. We'll finish this part with a Kaddish. It's a tradition to praise God for the lives that He gave us. It doesn't mention death or dying. And you have the words there, 619, 629. And please, 629, join me. Yitgadal v'yitkadosh shemei Baba,
בעלמא דירה חירותי וימליך מלכותי. וחייכון יומכון וחיי בכל בית ישראל. בעגלה בזמן קריב ולעולמם. יהי שמי רבה מבורך לעולם ועמי עמיה. יתברך וישתבח ויתפאר ויתרומם ויתנשא. ויתהדר ויתהלל ויתהלל שמי קדושה וברכו. לעליון מכל ברכתה ושקיעתה, טוש וחטא ונחמתה, תעננה בעלמא יאמרו אמן. יהי שלום רב מן שמיא, וחיים עלינו ועל כל ישראל. עושה שלום במרומיו, הוא יעשה שלום, עלינו ועל כל ישראל.
May the source of peace send peace to all more and send comfort to all the bereaved. And let us say, Amen. Thank you. Please be seated. I would like to ask Elizabeth to come and introduce our speaker for tonight. Oh, okay, sorry.
So I have the privilege of introducing our speaker tonight, who I have known basically my whole life. Just a little context. So there were a number of survivors that made their way to the city of Gary. Why there had to be somebody to sponsor you. That's how my own mother arrived in Gary, Indiana, as a young teenager alone. She had a distant cousin who agreed to sponsor her. And as a young child, I remember Rosalie's mom and dad quite well. They were very striking, beautiful people. Her mother had this amazing blaze of white and her very long hair. And her father had the gift of music. He had a beautiful, beautiful voice. So Rosalie comes from the unique perspective of having two parents who were survivors. And since her father's passing, Rosalie has picked up the torch. So since 2016, she's been telling their stories to school children. And she's also part of the leadership group Sliding Doors. And for those of you that don't know, DORS in Hebrew means generations. So sliding doors is sliding generations, like I am the second generation, and so is she. So it's an international program of our partnership together with the Western Galilee Consortium in Israel. So they reach out to second generation survivors, and she helps facilitate the online programs and leads local groups. In 2020, she was named the chair of the Jewish Federation Community Relations Committee of Northwest Indiana, the federation which focuses on promoting interfaith and understanding. Prior to that, Rosalie had a distinguished career as a law professor at Valparaiso School of Law, and she was the Phyllis and Richard Duesenberg Professor of Law until her retirement in 2016. So without further ado, I would like to welcome Rosalie Levinson, Professor Dr. Rosalie Levinson, to the stage. Thank you.
Thank you, Debbie, and it is Professor, not Doctor. I think I had Michael in my class and Mayor Costas as well. I'm pretty old. So I can't see the screen, but
I'll turn this way.
Oh, that would be good. Okay. So you see the title of my remarks is My Parents Never Spoke of It. And I'm going to start with just a few minutes to tell you a little bit about how I came to know my parents' story so that I could tell you about it this evening, and also why I have chosen to share their story. So go back to when I was a child, before you were born. She's a little younger. When I was a child, I had this recurring nightmare. I was being chased and I was horrified. I would find myself in front of two chutes. The mouths resembled the faces of a Greek tragicomedy. There was a smile and a frown. I had to choose one or the other. Now, I know that dreams of being chased by demons and lions and witches is all very common, but my dream was very unique. You see, whichever chute I picked, at the bottom, someone would be waiting with a branding iron to tattoo me. I never asked my mother about the blue numbers that were tattooed on her arm, and she never spoke of it. Later on, she had the numbers removed, but I knew what the scars covered up, although neither of my parents ever talked about the Holocaust. I knew that they had endured unspeakable horrors. I knew I had no grandparents. Once a year, my parents lit memorial candles like these for their parents as well as their siblings. My 3 siblings and I were named after 4 of these deceased relatives. This is the Jewish tradition. But I never knew why I had lost so much family, why there were so many candles to light. I never asked because I always sensed that in my home, the subject of the Holocaust was taboo. As a teenager, I learned about the Holocaust in Hebrew school. It was not taught in public schools back then. I vividly remember the pictures of the cattle cars filled with people and the photographs of heaps of dead bodies and near dead, emaciated men and women who the Allies found when they liberated the camps. I learned then that all 4 of my grandparents and many of my aunts and uncles and my 8 first cousins, all children, were among the 1.1 million Jews murdered at the killing center of Auschwitz-Birkenau. I remember feeling overwhelmed by an immense sense of sadness and horror, imagining my mother and father in those cattle cars and in those concentration camp barracks. I also felt anger that humankind had allowed this to happen. I did not ask my parents about their personal experiences, but I knew they had suffered enormously, and I vowed that I would strive to only bring them joy. So as a teenager, when many of my friends, most probably, were rebelling against their parents, I actually prayed every night before I went to sleep that I would always be a source of pride, nachas, we say, because my parents had endured enough sadness and horror to last a lifetime. In 1980, my younger sister, Deborah, wrote her master's thesis on children of Holocaust survivors. Her research pointed to recurring themes in these children that I could identify with: a sense of diminished family, loss, and a sense of guilt in ever doing anything that would make them upset. I have read many stories and studies confirming that children of Holocaust survivors like me often had terrible nightmares growing up, and as adults, many continue to suffer from debilitating anxiety and depression. Some have apparently absorbed and internalized the horror and the pain of their parents, a form of PTSD that is conveyed without words. Some of the children, like my older sister Margaret, were born soon after the war in displaced persons camps in Europe. They were born to parents who were physically and emotionally damaged, who had just lost most of their family and whose futures were uncertain. Not too surprisingly, the studies show that these children were most likely to suffer from phobias and serious psychological problems. Many survivors and their children demonstrate this increased vulnerability to stress, but interestingly, also extraordinary resilience, a coping mechanism that helps them face life's various challenges with strength and determination. And I know that I inherited this gene and that it saved my life. At age 52, I was diagnosed with acute myeloid leukemia and given 4 months to live. For the next 3 years, I underwent many rounds of chemotherapy and eventually a life-saving stem cell transplant. But I distinctly remember lying in my hospital bed struggling to stay alive after my kidneys had stopped, and I truly felt the shadow of death. But I was able to muster new strength, remembering what my parents had endured. Unlike me, they had every reason to give up hope. They had lost their loved ones and were surrounded by people who were trying to hate, were trying to destroy them and torture them. And I was in a place where everyone was trying to save me. I was surrounded by my family who encouraged me. I had so much to live for. Plus, I couldn't bear the thought of my parents having to endure the death of yet another loved one. So it was not until both of my parents passed away at age 62 that I finally learned their stories. Next slide. In the mid-1990s, my parents were among the 50,000 Holocaust survivors and eyewitnesses who gave their testimony to the survivors of the Shoah Visual History Foundation that was spearheaded by Steven Spielberg. My parents never let us watch those tapes. It was only after my beloved father passed away in 2010 that I found the recordings in their home. The cover reads, it's probably too small, but it says, "So generations never forget what so few live to tell." This is just one of their tapes. In the last years before he passed away, my father volunteered to go into schools. Indeed, he visited a school just 2 weeks before he passed away. But I never attended those talks. I never asked him anything about it. For me, the topic was still taboo. But watching those tapes, hearing my parents' truly horrifying stories made me realize that I had a personal responsibility to address and to teach, as my father did, about the Holocaust. I had to continue his legacy. There are very few Holocaust survivors left to tell their stories. I know that there are hundreds of books and many films about the Holocaust, and we can try to absorb the figures that the rabbi mentioned. 6 million died. 2 out of every 3 Jews in Europe were killed by the Nazis and their collaborators. 94% of the Jews of Lithuania, 90% of the Jews of Poland, 80% of the Jews of Slovakia and Yugoslavia and Greece, and the list goes on. 1/3 of the Jews in the entire world were annihilated. The Nazis and their collaborators succeeded in emptying an entire continent that was once the center of Jewish life. And it is more than 8 decades later, the Jewish population in the world today has not recovered. It is less than it was in 1939. The enormity of these figures is simply too great to comprehend. And I used to tell my students when I would talk about this that they should think of every Jewish person that they know. Every doctor, lawyers, teachers, friends, Jewish actors, comedians, journalists, directors, scientists, musicians, members of Congress, justices of the United States Supreme Court. And then imagine every single one of them and their families rounded up and murdered. You see, the population of Jews in this country today is just about 6 million. So imagine that every one of these people would be condemned to die. This can only begin to capture the Holocaust, the mass slaughter and persecution of the Jewish people. I have come to believe that it is only through personal stories that this enormous tragedy can begin to be understood, and that children of survivors like myself are uniquely situated to do this. By telling my parents' stories, I can show that the victims of the Holocaust were real people who had real lives that were utterly destroyed solely because of their Jewish heritage. 6 million were murdered, 1.5 million innocent children. Think of all the books and poems that were never written. Think of all the cures, medical cures that were never discovered because of this devastation. And remember, too, that those few who survived, like my parents, were subjected to unspeakable horrors that tragically affected not only their own lives, but also the lives of their children. It has taken me many years to talk about the it my parents never spoke about. I tell my parents' story because now, more than ever, the story needs to be told. The Holocaust didn't end genocide or ethnic cleansing. We've all heard of Kosovo and Bosnia and Myanmar and Darfur and Cambodia and Rwanda and now Ukraine. The human motivations that helped create the Holocaust, fear, envy, sadism, hatred, ignorance, are still present and on the rise throughout the world. We live in a toxic environment where hatred and bigotry are all too prevalent. Over the past few years, as Rabbi mentioned, acts of anti-Semitism have surged in the United States and throughout the world. The Anti-Defamation League just released their report for 2022. There were 3,697 incidents in this country targeting Jews and Jewish institutions, the largest number ever recorded since they began keeping track 40 years ago. Attacks on synagogues, Jewish schools, Jewish community centers increased multifold. The number of incidents in K through 12 went up 100%, 21% increase in college campuses. On average, 10 anti-Semitic incidents occur every single day. Jews are the target of 55% of religious hate crimes, even though we make up only 2.4% of the population. Next slide. In a sense, I am grateful that my parents were not here to see the 2017 alt-right rally in Charlottesville, Virginia, where white supremacists and Nazis gave salutes. They wore the swastika pins, the swastika flags. They carried signs saying Jews are Satan's children. And in 2018, we saw the deadliest attack on a Jewish community in the history of this country, when, of course, a man walked into the Tree of Life synagogue and opened fire on worshipers, killing 11 and wounding others while shouting, "All Jews must die." And on January 6, 2021, we all witnessed the horrific attack on the Capitol, which included many white supremacists and neo-Nazis sporting t-shirts with the words "Camp Auschwitz" and 6MWE, 6 million wasn't enough. Not so long ago, no American would have displayed their anti-Semitism so openly, but now they do so proudly. Sadly, anti-Semitism has been normalized because of its adoption and tolerance by prominent figures, including, and I know I shouldn't talk politics, but Donald Trump and his dining companions, Kanye West, who praises Hitler and denies the Holocaust, and white supremacist Nick Fuentes, as well as NBA All-Star Kyrie Irving. Last November, a shocking number of candidates running for office in high-profile elections openly espoused the anti-Semitic tropes of Jews being all-powerful puppeteers, controlling finance, the press, the media, and the government. Jews are accused of being responsible for everything that goes wrong in our country, from 9/11 to inflation to the pandemic. At the same time, a poll of young Americans reveals that 12% have never heard about the Holocaust, and another 63% do not believe or were unaware that 6 million Jews were killed. 11% actually said they thought Jews caused the Holocaust. On the other hand, half reported that they had seen Holocaust denial or distortion on social media. The internet has proven to be an alarmingly effective tool in spreading conspiracy theories and recruiting new followers to hate groups. My father felt compelled to speak out after he read about a conference that took place in December of 2006 in Iran, where Holocaust deniers from 30 countries gathered to refute the genocide. You see the headlines, maybe you can't, but it says, "I was there, I know what happened." And he told his story to the reporter. Jews, of course, are not the only victims, and whenever I give my talks, I always point out that certainly Muslims and Blacks and Latinos and Asians and the LGBTQ community have also been targets. Remembering the Holocaust is so important because it demonstrates the human capacity for hatred of the other, whoever the other is, and it also shows their capacity, the capacity for extreme unspeakable evil. It teaches how quickly hate can escalate from stereotypes to discrimination to mass murder if not addressed. What is so terrifying to me is that Nazi Germany was a modern, technologically advanced nation. Many, many Jews had assimilated. It was the safest country in Europe for Jews. And yet they engaged in a campaign to kill every Jew, man, woman, and child in Europe. And the perpetrators were well-educated, doctors, lawyers, judges, and scientists. The speed with which Germany descended into tyranny demonstrates the fragility of democracy, including our own. Holocaust survivor Elie Wiesel wrote these thought-provoking words. On the one side, there were the executioners, and on the other, the victims. What about the onlookers? Those who remained neutral, those who served the executioner simply by not interfering. Complacency towards hate and discrimination emboldens it. I tell my parents' story to honor their memory and to convey the critical importance of confronting all forms of hatred against all marginalized groups. So let me begin sharing what I saw on those tapes. Both of my parents came from a village in what was then Eastern Czechoslovakia, Negrovo. They came from large families with many sisters and brothers and aunts and uncles and cousins. My mother was raised on a large farm with a flour mill that had been in the family for generations. And my father's family had 300 acres of land, some of it used for farming, but most to provide lumber for their timber business. They were both well-to-do families, and they also were raised in very Orthodox Jewish homes. In fact, each of their families built a synagogue on their property, which was the center of community life. I'm going to focus first on my father's story. He recounts how education, especially religious education, was stressed in his family. At the tender age of 3, he attended Hebrew school. The Sabbath and the Jewish holidays were all wonderful events with extended family, lots of singing and dancing. At age 11, my father left home to attend the Gymnasium Ivrit. Some of you may have heard of that in Wunkach. It was a highly respected Jewish school, well known for its learned rabbis and rigorous standards. Just 6 years later, at age 17, he was forced to leave school because in September of 1938, Germany seized the western part of Czechoslovakia, the Sudetenland, and the eastern part was turned over to Hungary. Soon after my father returned home from school, the Jews were required to wear yellow armbands depicted, I think you can see on the bottom of that slide. That way they could be identified and targeted for beatings in the street. Hungarian police would randomly visit Jewish homes to beat up family members for no reason. German records document that during the summer of 1941, 20,000 Jews from this region were rounded up and shipped to Poland, where they were machine gunned and buried in mass graves. This was going on all over Europe. I'm sure you have heard of actually it was 1.3 million Jews were killed this way by the Eisengruppen, the mobile killing machines in 1941 alone. My father's family heard about mass deportation and execution of Polish Jews, but they had no idea the magnitude of what was going on. In September of 1943, my father, who had just turned 21, was conscripted into the Nazi-controlled Hungarian army. Like all young, able-bodied Jews of this region, he was assigned a special slave labor camp, the Arbeit, or Work Battalion. He dug trenches, planted mines, and built military bunkers for 15 hours every day. Many young men were killed planting the mines, and my father recounted his own very close brush with death. Food was very meager, and the punishment was swift and cruel for anyone who just couldn't keep up. They would be hung by their feet and beaten till they lost consciousness, then ice-cold water would be splashed at them and they would be beaten again. In the spring of 1944, the German Gestapo arrived. They began loading my father's platoon into boxcars headed for Poland. An SS soldier ordered my father to stand in the doorway while he sadistically slammed the boxcar door on his face, permanently blinding him in his left eye. Upon arriving in Poland, the battalion was assigned to build bridges. Their daily food consisted of soup made from potato scraps and a tiny piece of black bread. In the fall of 1944, our Russian allies began their advance, and the SS transported the remnants of my father's brigade to the Hungarian-Austrian border. There they were forced to sleep outside. Anyone caught trying to find warmth in the barn where the cattle were kept would be immediately shot. By winter, over half the young men, including my father, had contracted typhus, and almost half of the infected died from the disease. All suffered from malnutrition and frostbite. As the Russian allies continued to advance, the SS forced the men to march again, this time to Vienna. My father recounts how a few Viennese, in an unusual display of courage and compassion, threw down bread from their apartment windows towards the emaciated Jewish men who were marching. The Gestapo immediately started to fire up at the windows, and they shot and killed any Jew who tried to pick up a morsel of bread. It was not uncommon for the SS to randomly select 20 to 25 of my father's platoon, require the men to dig their own graves, and then shoot them. And as they march, and I find this particularly horrific, Hitler Jugend, young teens indoctrinated to believe that Jews were no better than rats who needed to be exterminated. These gangs would stop the men, beat them, and often kill them. Finally, in March of 1945, they arrived at their destination in Austria. This is Mauthausen, the concentration camp that had the highest death rate of the so-called work camps. It wasn't a death camp, presumably, but it specialized in working its prisoners to death by forcing them to carry 100-pound rocks up 186 stairs from the granite quarry. There was absolutely no food. My father saw only skeletons. He subsisted on tree bark, grass, and puddles. He watched men and women fall into the latrines and drown from starvation and exhaustion. But the suffering didn't end there. As the Allies closed in, the Nazis forced the remaining 60,000 men and women at Mauthausen to evacuate. This was dubbed the Death March, but it was only one of many that the Nazis imposed on their victims. Over half the men and women couldn't keep up and were shot. My father would have been one of them. He could no longer walk. But a Jewish man, a total stranger to him, somehow mustered up the strength to pick him up on his back and carry him to the next camp. Next slide. In April of 1945, just weeks before the end of the war in Europe, my father arrived in Gunskirchen, a newly constructed concentration camp in Austria. Nazi records confirm that 18,000 men and women were shoved into barracks intended to house 300 people. They were given no food. Dozens died daily from disease and starvation. The Nazis would deliver a supply of water 2 times a week, But when the few men strong enough to retrieve the water would go out there, they would be shot at. My father's closest friend from his hometown was killed trying to get a water just 4 days before the liberation. Until the bitter end, the SS continued to take pleasure in torturing and shooting at the Jewish men. My father recounts that when the end was imminent, the Red Cross sent packages intended to sustain the prisoners in the camp, but the Germans kept the food and sadistically gave the men the tooth powder. I have read the reports and seen the photos taken by the U.S. battalion that liberated Gunskirchen. It describes, and I quote, an absolute hellhole with sick, insane, dying skeletons, bodies lying 3 deep, some alive, but most dead. By this point, my father was too ill to remember much, but he vividly recalls looking up from his bed and seeing Jewish men carrying guns. The SS was nowhere to be seen. It was May 4th, 1945, my father's liberation day. He was taken to a hastily constructed Red Cross hospital near Vienna, where he was deloused and treated for severe malnutrition. He had lost over half his body weight. A few weeks later, the Czech government sent trucks to Vienna to collect the Czech nationals like my father and return them to their homes. But my father had no home. A Russian family was living in his house, and Russian authorities refused to intervene on his behalf. It was then that my father learned his parents' fate. I'm showing you a picture of my father's sister's wedding. It's Devora and her husband, as well as you can see my father's grandparents in this picture. All of them, of course, were murdered, as well as by that time the couple had 2 young boys who were killed, as well as numerous aunts, uncles, and cousins. Shortly after returning home, my father found my mother. They had met before the war when my father was 15 and my mother was 12. They performed in a play together, and my father often said he fell in love at first sight. He was elated to find that she was among the few of their village who had survived. Next slide. My mother has no pictures of herself when she was young. It was all destroyed, but this picture was taken a few years after she arrived in this country in the late 1940s. My mother describes her childhood as idyllic and innocent. She was the youngest of 5, 3 older sisters and a brother. And because of the large age gap between herself and her siblings, she readily admits that she was spoiled, in particular by her father, who doted on her. Her older brother, Daniel, moved back into the home together with his wife and 2 children to help run the family's business, and Daniel's son and daughter became my mother's companions, and they filled the home with laughter and happiness. My mother's older sister, Esther, married and had 4 little girls, and they all came home to celebrate the Jewish holidays. Every Sabbath was joyful, filled with lots of singing and dancing. My mother said she saw no anti-Semitism as a child. She recounts that the Jews got along very well with their Christian neighbors. All the children played together in public school. My grandfather was loving and generous to everyone. My mother recalls when he arranged and paid for the funeral of a poor Christian neighbor. But all of this came to an abrupt halt in the fall of 1939 when Nazi-controlled Hungary occupied her village. My mother had just turned 14. Everyone was forced to wear the yellow armbands and later Stars of David. The Jewish children, like my mother, were kicked out of the public schools. Jews were not allowed to own businesses or really to go anywhere in any public places. There were rumors about Jews being persecuted and deported, but my mother's father assured the family that they had nothing to fear. This would all blow over like the many pogroms that periodically erupted in Europe and Eastern Europe and Russia. My mother specifically remembers her father telling her that as long as FDR was the president of the United States, nothing would happen to the law-abiding, respectable members of the Jewish community. Only after the war did she learn that in June of 1939, the SS St. Louis, a ship carrying 1,000 Jewish refugees fleeing Nazi Germany, was turned away by our country, as well as Canada, as well as Cuba. The refugees were forced to return to Europe, where they faced likely death. In 1941, my mother's beloved brother Daniel was conscripted into the Hungarian army. Shortly thereafter, the family received a notice that Daniel was missing in action. Only later did my mother learn the terrible truth. Daniel, together with 100 young Jewish men, were pushed into a barn that was set on fire, and all of them were murdered. For my mother, the real nightmare began in April 1944. She was 18 years old. She and her family were leaving the synagogue after Passover services. Every time this year, I think of my mother thinking of what happened to her on Pesach. Hungarian soldiers ordered them back into the synagogue where they were kept overnight. The next morning, without allowing them to go home to retrieve any belongings, they were transported to a red brick factory a few miles away. They remained there for several weeks, sleeping on concrete floors with no bathroom facilities, barely enough food to survive, and no explanation of what was going to happen to them. My mother remembers the constant din of crying and wailing. And at one point, my mother's parents tried to escape with the two grandchildren. They had heard that the young, able-bodied teenagers and adults like my mother would be sent to work for the Nazis, but that the elderly and the children would be killed. They, of course, were caught and returned that same night. My grandfather was severely beaten, and my mother remembers that this was the moment when she entered into a state of shock and numbness that would continue throughout her ordeal. After a few weeks, the transportation from the red brick factories began to Auschwitz. Nazi records document that and I found all of this information, the Nazis were great at keeping records. Over the last 10 days, in May of 1944, 29,000 Czech and Hungarian Jews were loaded into 9 cattle boxcars, 3,000, a little over 3,000 in each. My mother recounts how they were given no food and only 1 bucket of water per boxcar. There was no place to relieve oneself, barely enough air to breathe. My mother later learned that her grandmother was among the thousands who perished in those boxcars. Next slide. After a hellish 3-day journey, they arrived in Auschwitz. The sign reads, Arbeit macht frei, work will free you. But deadly gas, not work, awaited the vast majority of the arrivals. My mother described the overwhelming stench of burning flesh from the crematoria, and also from large outside fires where bodies were being tossed because there were too many bodies for the ovens to handle. And she watched in horror as Jews were thrown alive into the ovens because the gas chambers were full. The sound of people screaming out in agony never ended. My mother vividly remembers seeing the infamous Dr. Mengele, the so-called angel of death, notorious for his cruel medical experiments on his victims. He was waiting on that platform. He directed the new arrivals to the right or the left. My mother saw her mother, her sister-in-law, and her precious niece and nephew, her childhood companions, directed to the left. They were gassed and cremated that same day. My mother and her older sister were directed to the right. She was warned to never acknowledge the relationship because experimentation on siblings was one of Dr. Mengele's evil specialties. The next morning, my mother was stripped of her identity as a person. She became that number tattooed on her arm. Her head was shaved, and she and 17 other young women were taken to Birkenau, the death camp annex of Auschwitz. Her job was to sort through massive piles of clothing and jewelry that was taken from the victims before they entered the gas chambers. My mother was horrified to find her mother's dress, confirming what she already suspected, that her mother had perished. These young women were always hungry and horribly frightened. The Nazis made sure of this. One day, they forced the women to watch the hanging of 14 young girls who were screaming out in agony. The purpose was to teach the girls to behave and obey, or this would be their fate. Another time, they were taken to watch the beards being ripped off the faces of rabbis whose limbs were then torn off. These displays of shocking, barbaric cruelty formed the nightmares that haunted my mother throughout her life. At one point, my mother saw her father in the distance at the camp, but she was too frightened to acknowledge him. Any infraction triggered cruel punishment or death. Her sister was severely beaten when she tried to shake the lice out of their blankets. My mother and her sister remained at Auschwitz for an agonizing 8 months until early January 1945, just a few weeks before the Americans liberated Auschwitz. Instead, my mother was forced to march through Poland in the freezing cold with no shoes, no boots, of course, and during that march, thousands died of starvation and illness. My mother learned later that her beloved father was among those shot to death because they simply couldn't keep up. The remnants who survived, like my mother, were taken to another infamous concentration camp, Ravensbrück, 50 miles north of Berlin. It was known as Hitler's Hell for Women, the crazy house, because so many occupants had gone insane. Many were kept in cages. Lice and disease were everywhere. My mother was told that no one left Ravensbrück alive. Miraculously, she and her sister were among a select few women who were chosen to work in a German airplane factory near Hamburg. Keep in mind, this is just months before the end. They were boarded onto crowded cattle cars. When the trains stopped to pick up others, some of the women would jump off to relieve themselves, but once the train started, anyone on the ground was shot. My mother would have been one of them, but for the outstretched arm of a complete stranger who pulled her back on board just in the nick of time. It's so amazing my parents survived. My mother worked in this airplane factory until her liberation day by the Russians on May 8, 1945, Victory in Europe Day. She remembered one day waking up and seeing the watchtowers empty and then watching the Germans surrender their guns. Unlike the American soldiers who liberated my father, the Russian soldiers offered the survivors little help. To the contrary, some of the young women were actually raped by their so-called liberators. My mother quickly piled her sister, who was deathly ill from typhoid fever, into a wheelbarrow, and she began the month-long journey walking home. Both she and her sister weighed only about 60 pounds each. The hope of finding family was the only thing that kept them alive. Finally, they crossed the border into Czechoslovakia and made their way to their hometown. It was then that my mother learned that almost all of her beautiful family was gone. In addition to her parents, her grandmother, her brother Daniel, Daniel's wife, and the 2 children, she learned that her sister Esther, Esther's husband, and their 4 little girls had all been murdered. And as was the case with my father, Russians had seized her home, and she was unable to retrieve even a single photo of her parents and siblings. Her past had been obliterated. My parents' story painfully demonstrates the human capacity for extreme, unspeakable evil. I hope by telling my story, it will strengthen everyone, their resolve to show greater respect and compassion for all those who are the target of hate in our world today, so that the it my parents never talked about will never happen again. I end my talk when speaking to young people, which is normally what I do, by telling them that my parents also should give them a lesson in perseverance and resilience. My parents were teenagers, like them, when the Nazis invaded and destroyed their lives. Despite the unspeakable horrors they experienced, they were able to start over, to marry, to have children, and to provide a loving home. So I end with the next slide, which is my parents celebrating their 25th wedding anniversary. My mother and father did not allow hatred, bitterness, or revenge to dominate their lives. They rose above it. Their strength and courage continues to inspire me to tell their stories. Thank you.
I want to thank you all for coming this evening. We have some refreshments if you'd like to talk a little bit in the community room. And is there anything you want to add, Shoshana, Elizabeth? It's a somber subject, but an important subject to remember, right?
You know, I just want to say something. Changing my mind. Changing my mind. No, just very short. You know, we have people here from different places, different religions, different communities, and it's so nice that we come together and show respect and feel the emotions of the speaker. It was really very strong. And I hope we all took it to heart and remember how important it is that everyone has dignity and respect, and we should love people and be compassionate and just try to help each other. You know, there is no place for hate in the world, really. Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you.